This is the last lecture before test number 2. It is the election of 1816. In the meantime, I wanted to let you know that I have updated the lecture on American culture under James Monroe. I have put the pictures into the lecture that is on D2L. I had mentioned that I was going to do that about a week ago. Have had difficulty in being able to do that. It's a type of program that I had to get special help with. Have finally gotten that done. And so that is ready for you to watch. That is one of the lectures that I would normally have told you to read the material before coming to class, and then I would show you the pictures. But since we don't have a class to go to, I put the pictures into the lecture, so you are responsible for that on the test. There will be questions on the test based upon that lecture, and the pictures are there for you to observe as you are reading the lecture. But this is the last lecture before the test, and earlier I had said there are 3 lectures of which you are to give me a question off of each, but the lectures went longer than I had anticipated, so you are just going to be doing the 2 questions off of those 2 previous lectures. This 3rd lecture is simply on James Monroe and will be the final lecture for material on test number 2. Instead, for this lecture, I want you to be thinking about his administration and come up with, for me, a true-false question. Earlier you had come up with, for me, 2 multiple choice questions on some previous lectures. This time I want you to come up with, for me, 2 2 true-false questions from the James Monroe administration. Then on the email location that is listed on the front page of the course syllabus, the school email, I want you to email it to me with your name, and that will give you credit for having watched this video. So please, for your attendance, send me 2 true-false questions. And we begin today with the election of 1816. And let me see if I can get this to move. Come on, how do I? Oh, this thing is always, okay, there we go. I got it to move. Now, how do I get back? Oh, come on. Let's go back. You're not going to go back. You're going to do that to me, huh? Come on. There we go. All right. James Monroe stood 6 foot tall. He was somewhat stooped, courtly, and mild-mannered. He was nominated for the presidency in 1816 by the Republicans. They thus undertook to continue the so-called Virginia dynasty of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. The fading Federalists ran a candidate for their last time in history, Mr. Rufus King. He was crushed by 183 electoral votes to 34. And James Monroe's vice presidential candidate of Daniel D. Tompkins, he will have for both his first and second terms. Here the election map, we have no split states here. Every single state goes through with full votes. Never brilliant and perhaps not great, the serene Virginian with gray blue eyes was an intellect and personal force amongst the least distinguished of the first 8 presidents. But the times was called for sober administration, not for heroics. And Monroe was an experienced, level-headed executive with an ear-to-the-ground talent for interpreting popular rumblings. The phrase, era of good feelings, has since been commonly used to describe the administration of Monroe. This was, for the most part, except for during the last part of his first administration, a good time, a positive time of American history. And here you have James Monroe taking the oath of office, being sworn in, and of course behind him his vice president Daniel Tompkins. During his end of his administration, there is a panic of 1819, a curse of hard times. This brought about a deflation, depression, bankruptcy, bank failures, unemployment, soup kitchens, overcrowded pest houses known as debtor's prison. This was the first of the national financial panics since President Washington had taken office. Many factors contributed to the catastrophe of 1819, but looming large was overspeculation in frontiers lands. The Bank of the United States, unfortunately, began to pull back on mortgages, and countless farms, the foreclosure hammers came down on them. All this was technically legal, but politically unwise. In the eyes of the Western debtor, the bank soon became a kind of financial devil. The panic of 1819 also created backwashes in the political and social world. It has hit especially hard the poorer classes and hence helped cultivate the seedbed of Jacksonian democracy. It also directed attention to the inhumanity of imprisoning debtors. In extreme cases, often although overplayed, mothers were torn from their infants for owing a few dollars. Mounting agitation against imprisonment for debt bore fruit in remedial legislation in an increasing number of states. For the most part, for our test purposes, we are skipping the panic of 1819 and moving on to a much more important issue, and that is the Missouri Compromise. Sectional tensions were revealed in 1819 when the territory of Missouri asked for admission as a slave state. But the House of Representatives threw a monkey wrench into the plans of the Missourians by passing the Talmadge Amendment. Let me go ahead and go back. Missouri is the first territory created out of, other than Louisiana, out of the Louisiana Purchase that is asking for statehood. And the Missouri Compromise is also known as the Compromise of 1820. So whichever term you hear use, Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise, it is the same piece of legislation. The Talmadge Amendment stipulated that no more slaves should be brought into Missouri. So Missouri says we want to come in as a slave state, and the Talmadge Amendment says fine, you can come in as a slave state, but once you come in as a slave state, no more slaves can be brought into Missouri. So if you have 15,000 slaves in Missouri at the time you become a state, there will never be more than 15,000 slaves in Missouri. It also provided for the gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents already there. A mounting roar of anger burst from slaveholding Southerners. Southerners saw the Talmadge Amendment, which was defeated in the Senate, as an ominous threat to sectional balance. With every passing decade, the North was becoming wealthier and more thickly settled, an advantage reflected in an increasingly Northern majority in the House of Representatives. Yet in the Senate, there is equality, with 11 states free and 11 states slave. The Southerners had been able to maintain equality. Missouri was the first state entirely west of the Mississippi River to be carved out of this Louisiana Purchase. And the Missouri Emancipation Amendment, this Talmadge Amendment, might set a damaging precedent for all the rest of the area. If Congress could abolish the peculiar institution in Missouri, might it not attempt to do likewise in the older states in the South? So, if you're going to mess with slavery here, how long until you start messing with slavery down here? Deadlock in Washington was at length broken in 1820 when Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and in the next 30 years he will have the nickname the Great Compromiser. He will constantly be trying to work out compromises between the North and the South. He is from the West. He is from Kentucky. Henry Clay of Kentucky plays a leading role now in the compromise. Congress, despite abolitionist pleas, agrees to admit Missouri as a slave state. But at the same time, Free Soil, Maine, which until then had been a part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a separate state. The balance between North and South would thus be kept at 12-12. So, previous we were at 11-11. Now, slave state Missouri comes in, 12 slave. Free state Maine comes in, 12 free. So this is when Massachusetts finally is forced to give its possession of Maine up. So that's why it is called the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1820, because this all takes place in the year of 1820. Although Missouri was permitted to retain slaves, all future bondage was permitted in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of the line 3630. 3630, which is the southern boundary of Missouri. So yes, you came in, you are north of that, and you will have slaves. The South really didn't quibble at that, because slavery is profitable where you have labor-intensive crops, rice, indigo, tobacco, cotton, Once you're getting into this area of the country, the weather is very different. Here you cannot grow those types of crops. Here you're growing wheat, corn, soybeans, things that are not labor intensive. And so slavery is not as profitable. And so they agreed, fine, this will come in slave, but anything north of this line in the future Louisiana territory will not be open to slavery. And the next election, the election of 1820. James Monroe was so popular and the Federalist opposition so weak that in the presidential election of 1820 he received every single electoral vote except one. And once again, he has Daniel Tompkins as his running mate. Every elector except one. This is the era of good feelings. And the one elector that voted against him had no problem with him and would have voted for him, but the old geezer said, "Unanimity is an honor that should be reserved only for George Washington." And so instead he voted for John Quincy Adams. So to this day, George Washington has the record of being elected twice unanimously, and the only president to ever be elected unanimously. Monroe, except for one vote, almost elected unanimously his second term. And foreign affairs will entertain a great deal of Monroe's second administration. His Secretary of State was the very able John Quincy Adams, and to his credit, the Monroe administration succeeded in negotiation with England a much underrated treaty of 1818. This position of Secretary of State was a very valuable position. To this day, it's a very valuable position, but back then, even more so than today. If you wanted to become president, being Secretary of State was one of the best ways to become president. Still to this day, it is a very good way to become president, but more so back then. Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State was James Monroe. James Monroe. James Monroe's Secretary of State was James Madison. James Madison's Secretary of State was James Monroe. James Monroe's Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. So it was launching board into the presidency. Well, as Secretary of State, he works out the very underrated treaty with England of 1818. Incidentally enough, John Quincy Adams goes down in history as one of the best Secretary of States ever, but as presidents, one of the worst ever. The treaty makers agreed to define the vague northern limits of Louisiana, which henceforth would now follow the 49th parallel. Remember, Napoleon had purposely made the boundary very vague, hoping to cause tension between the U.S. and England. Canada is owned by Britain. So now we decide, hey, starting with the Lake of the Woods, let's just follow the 49th parallel until we reach the Oregon Territory, the Oregon country. Do we give up some land? Yes. Do they give up some land? Yes. I think overall we probably got the better end of the deal in how much land we acquired here versus the amount we gave up there. So we will simply follow the 49th parallel out. The Treaty of 1818 also provided for a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon country without surrendering claims or rights to it, either by America or Britain. Of course, Lewis and Clark had come through and camped on the coast and come back on their way back from their surveying of the Louisiana Territory. So we were claiming the territory for ourselves. England had long claimed the territory for England. So since we're all playing nice in the sandbox, we don't want to have to discuss issues that might not be pleasant. So we say, no one is going to give up rights here at this stage. We will discuss it in 10 years. Well, in 10 years, what do we decide? Well, in 10 years, we're all still playing nice in the sandbox, and no one wants to discuss it. So we will tack another 10 years on it. And 20 years later, we will finally decide what to do. And what we will ultimately do is simply take the 49th parallel, carry it out to the coastline, and our entire northern boundary from the Lake of the Woods simply follows the 49th parallel. It does not connect to the island peninsula here. That whole peninsula belongs to Canada, but we will follow the 49th parallel. But that's ahead. That is part of test number 3. And Spain. To the south lay semi-tropical Florida. This coveted peninsula, many believed, occupied a part of the map which geography and providence had destined for the United States. When an epidemic of revolutions broke out in South America, Spain was forced to denude Florida of troops to fight the rebels. A chaotic situation rapidly developed in the swampy peninsula. Bands of Indians, runaway slaves, and white outcasts poured across the border into American territory, here burning and scalping. They would then flee back to the safety of the Florida border. So, for a time period, you had chaos going on in Central and South America. Many of Spain's colonies were fighting for independence, and Spain was trying as best they could to hold on to their colonies, but were losing many of them. And so any troops they could spare, they were sending to Central and South America. So Florida was basically denuded of any type of military force. And so bands of these people were crossing, attacking, doing as they pleased, running back across the border. Now, if we could catch them on our side, could we prosecute them? Yes, we could. But once they got back into Spanish territory in Florida, it is against the law to go into another country's sovereignty and deal with their citizenry. So they are untouchable. Well, yes, they're untouchable, Here, a drawing showing the Indians and Negroes massacring the whites in Florida. So not only were whites in Florida being massacred, but across the border in the United States as well. Andrew Jackson, General Andrew Jackson, he now is given orders by President Monroe, and he sweeps across the Florida border. He is given orders to go down and try and create a semblance of order. What he does is well beyond what orders he has been given. He hangs 2 Indian chiefs without ceremony, and after a hasty military trial, he executes 2 British subjects for assisting the Indians. He also seized the 2 most important Spanish posts in the area, St. Mark's and then Pensacola, where he deposed the Spanish governor, who was lucky enough to escape Jackson's noose. Did we have the right to depose the Spanish governor who was there? Heavens no. This is not our country. Here, the mangroves in the Everglades down in Florida. And here you can see some native Indians hiding, and Jackson and his men looking for the quote-unquote problem makers. And another artist's version of Jackson and his troops fighting against the Indians down in Florida. Jackson had clearly exceeded his instructions from Washington. President Monroe, when he is notified of what has happened, in alarm, he consults his cabinet. Its members were for censuring and disavowing the overzealous Jackson, all except John Quincy Adams. Far from apologizing, poor Monroe is thinking this is going to be an international incident here. No. John Quincy Adams takes the offense, and he says quite emphatically that we were going to inform Spain that Spain, had violated the Spanish-American Treaty of 1795 by not suppressing the outlaws of Florida. He then insisted that the alternatives were for the Spanish to control the area, a task that they admitted was impossible, or to cede it to the United States, a course which was galling to their pride. They would have rather seen Florida drop into the ocean than to give it to the United States. But we are telling them, according to our treaties, you are to control your territory, and you didn't control it. We had to step in and control it, and that is not our job to have to step in and control your territory. The Spaniards perceived that they were going to lose Florida anyway. They wisely decided to dispose of the alligator-infested area while they could get something for it. The Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819, so-called, was actually mislabeled. It involves more than just Florida. The western boundary of the Louisiana Territory, which was hitherto vague, was now made to zigzag along the Rockies all the way up to the 42nd parallel. So first of all, yes, they agree we cannot control Florida, and so yes, we will cede, we will give to you Florida in 1819. And for us to give you Florida, you in return will not look lustfully at our state of Tejas over here. And so the boundary, remember once again, Napoleon had, it sort of goes here and it sort of goes there, had made the boundary between the Louisiana Territory and Spain very vague. Well, now we work out the exact boundary in the 1819 treaty until we get up to the 42nd parallel, and once we hit the 42nd parallel, it goes straight across to the ocean. And above that, of course, is the Oregon Territory. So we work out the boundary. We will not look at Tejas, and we acquire Florida. So we worked things out peaceably under John Quincy Adams with England for the northern boundary here, and we've worked out things peaceably with Spain for our western southern boundary, and we have acquired Florida. In 1819, Spain in effect ceded Florida and her shadowy rights to any claim to Oregon as well, and we gave up any pretensions to Texas. The United States also agreed to assume claims for damages to the extent of $5 million, seemingly uncollectible claims which American citizens had filed against the Spanish government. Those attacks of whites, outcasts, blacks, Indians that had raided up into the United States, U.S. citizens had put claims against the Spanish government for damages amounting to $5 million. Are they going to be able to collect from a Spanish empire that can't even hang on to their colonies? No. So the United States government says we will pay our own citizens back the $5 million they have claimed against you. Yes, you lost Florida, but you saved face. And the Monroe Doctrine. While Europe, in particular Spain, was in chaos and dealing with internal difficulties, their American colonies had declared independence and become independent republics. Now, according to the European rumor factory, Spain was going to try and return to the Americas and regain their ancestral domains. So, between 1800 and 1820, excuse me, Spanish claims here shown in green. All of this territory, they of course had now just to us lost Florida. Much of this has all been lost piece by piece by piece, and by 1830 she has lost everything except for islands in the Caribbean. And there is big talk in the 20s that Spain is finally getting her act together, and she's going to come back and try to slowly, one piece at a time, regain some of her former empire. The Monroe Doctrine was born late in 1823 when the nationalistic Adams won the nationalistic Monroe over to his way of thinking. The Monroe Doctrine is John Quincy Adams' idea. This is his baby. But when you are not the boss, you are the secretary, it is the boss that gets credit for the idea. The president, in his regular annual message to Congress of December 2nd, 1823, incorporated the Monroe Doctrine as a stern warning to the European powers. Every year, the president is required to give a State of the Union address. Constitution requires it. He must tell Congress what is the state of the Union. How is the government going? And he incorporates this Monroe Doctrine into his State of the Union address. And here you have in a cabinet meeting in 1823, before he incorporates it into his State of the Union address, Monroe discussing the Monroe Doctrine with his inner circle. And here you have John Quincy Adams. To me, that actually looks more like Henry Clay, but the website I looked this picture up, the artist claimed he was trying to draw John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams usually has more of a tummy on him and is a bit balder and did not have the long hair, so I swear that that is actually Henry Clay. But here you have William Harris Crawford, who is big in politics. William Wirt, I have no idea who that is, so it could or could not look like him. I have no idea. John C. Calhoun, and that very much does look like John C. Calhoun. Daniel Tompkins, Vice President, that does look like Tompkins. And John McLean, I have no idea who that is, so that could or could not be him. And yes, that does look like James Monroe. So he is having a meeting and, of course, got the map out, discussing and North and South and Central America, discussing the Monroe Doctrine here. And yes, a piece of the Monroe Doctrine that was incorporated into his State of the Union address. It was a stern warning to the European powers. Its two basic features were, first of all, non-colonization, and second, non-intervention. With emphatic tones, he proclaimed, in effect, that the era of colonization in America had ended, and that henceforth there would be a permanently closed season. What the great powers had, they could keep. So if you had Spain control of Cuba, you could keep Cuba. But if you had lost control of Nicaragua, it is gone forever. And Holland, if you think that that newly created Republic of Nicaragua looks like something choice you would like to come over and gobble up, fat chance. It is not open for you to come over and gobble up. So what you have you may keep, but you may not come and acquire anything that you do not already own. At the time, Monroe sounded a trumpet blast against foreign intervention. He was clearly concerned with regions to the south where fears were felt for the newly fledged Spanish-American republics. He bluntly warned the crowned heads of Europe to keep their hated monarchical systems out of his hemisphere. For its part, the United States would not intervene in the war that the Greeks were then fighting with the Turks for their independence. Thus begins that philosophy that we would have for the next 150 years or so. You stay in your hemisphere, we stay in our hemisphere. This would lead all the way up until World War I. So the Greeks and the Turks are fighting, not our hemisphere. We're staying out of it. And some cartoons showing that Monroe Doctrine. Here are good old Uncle Sam. This is our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, and South America. The Monroe Doctrine applies. Europe, this is your hemisphere. You stay in your hemisphere. And another cartoon. The ocean, the great Atlantic Ocean. Oh, how small that little ocean is looking here. And Uncle Sam is on our side saying, "No trespass, America for Americans," Uncle Sam. And here is the monarchs of Europe, and we are telling them, do not cross into our hemisphere. Some more cartoons. And once again, that great ocean in between, once again, not looking so huge anymore, but there you've got James Monroe standing in the Americas, and he says, "Stop," by order of the Monroe Doctrine. And who is backing us? Our good buddy Great Britain, who's got Canada up there behind us. So we and England are enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. Pay no attention to that man behind me. I am the great and powerful Pontus. And here you have, after his great defeats, a very beat up Napoleon and the other European powers who've all been fighting in the flames of Europe going on here. And one more Monroe Doctrine. Here, Uncle Sam has laid out the Monroe Doctrine. You don't cross Europe and your monarchies. This is our side, that is your side. In truth, Monroe's message actually did not have much contemporary significance. Americans applaud it and then forgot it, as they turned back to such activities as felling trees and Indians. The doctrine had no standing in international law. It was merely a statement of intent sent by an American president to Congress, and did not even draw enough interest at the time for European powers to acknowledge it. Not until 1845 did President Polk revive it, and not until mid-century did it become an important national dogma. So at the time it is issued, no one really took it seriously. Later, when we become a more important nation, more militarily powerful, we will get it out from time to time, dust it off, and show it to the world again. And then finally, the worst stages of it will be when Teddy Roosevelt does the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and puts some very negative aspects to the Monroe Doctrine. But this is the first issuing of it. Europe, you stay in your hemisphere, and we stay in ours. And the last piece before test number 2, and that is the biography of James Monroe. Please do not forget to read that on D2L. And yes, he is the creator, architect, well, actually his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is. The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subject for future colonization by any European power. First Lady Elizabeth Monroe, and a picture of her with her 2 daughters. They will have a total of 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, but the son does not live long. He dies at 16 months, and so the 2 daughters do live to adulthood. And so here you have the 3 women of the Monroe family, the 2 daughters later in life, Eliza and Marie. During the Revolutionary War, Monroe fights with Washington and is actually very severely wounded in one of the battles. Here, this is artist's conception. Washington was wounded in the hand, and you see his hand here in a glove, I guess bandaged up. And here is Lieutenant Monroe. They don't show him very tall. He was 6 foot tall. He was a tall gentleman. Maybe he sort of slouched over because of his wound, but was very severely wounded in one of the battles with Washington. Considered quite a courageous officer in the war. He had more than one home. Many people back then had more than one home, particularly if they were wealthy. His biggest home was Oak Hill, and I have not had a chance to visit Oak Hill. This is a picture of it. It definitely looks like it needs some renovations. Quite possibly it is renovated and open to the public to see. I have not been there. Here I have a like a postcard of the home back in the day. Very beautiful. Statue of him on the property there. The architect of his home just so happened to be James Hoban, who also was the architect of the White House. Wouldn't that be cool? My house was designed by the architect of the White House. Well, la-di-da-di-da. I wish I was wealthy too. A second home of his, this one I have visited, and this home is known as Ashlawn Highland, and in this picture you can see it is painted 2 different colors. The reason being, the home as it existed while Monroe lived there is white. This yellow is add-on, and when we were there they were talking about demolishing this to make it look like how it was while he lived there, but at that time they had not demolished it and were just discussing and debating it. But this is the extent of the house, plus there was basement. The kitchen is all basement underneath. It's sort of on a hill that dips down, and so the kitchen, which is basement, opens out and is like a 2-story in the back. They have recreated what would have been like slave quarters, because this was a working plantation, so you could see how the slaves would have lived at the time. To be quite honest, I don't remember if much of this furniture was actually James Monroe's, or if they just redecorated it in period type furniture, and if any of the dishes were his. Possibly some of the furniture and dishes were. I don't remember exactly. Wallpaper, very, very expensive that time period, and so anyone who had wallpaper in their home had to be very wealthy in order to afford wallpaper. So only the wealthy would have had wallpaper. And here your own piano. I'm sure that this was the parlor where you would not live normally. You would have only used to entertain guests. And an upstairs bedroom. I mentioned that kitchen that was in the basement. The kitchen opened to ground level, so it was like 2 stories from here. And here are some slave quarters. This one was probably a 1 family, but here you've got 1, 2, and 3 family residents all in that one building. another bedroom in the house. Young picture, older picture of James Monroe. Painting, I should say. His wife dies a year before him, Elizabeth. And I'm assuming because he is president, some group, I mean, if you have the title Era of Good Feeling, people from your state, maybe people from the federal government, maybe the family, who knows, but quite a nice little shindig building for your casket to reside in. Yes, the tomb, mausoleum for our 5th president, James Monroe. And talk about do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Here we have James Monroe, only the 5th president, but he is the 3rd president to die on July 4th. Boy, if I was John Quincy Adams, I think I'd start getting nervous once I was president and every 4th of July started to draw near. First of all, his dad, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson had both died on the same day on the 4th of July. Remember? Jefferson alone survives. And it was with regard to those that had met, what was it, for the signing of the Declaration of Independence 50 years later, or if it was for the Continental Congress, whatever it was. He and Jefferson were the last two that were still alive. And unbeknownst to him, hours earlier, Thomas Jefferson had passed away. Now, Monroe dies on July 4th, but not on the exact same July 4th as Jefferson and Adams did. But yes, 3 presidents of our first 5 die on July 4th. Ooh, that'd be sort of a good question for Jeopardy, and someday you will know the answer. Very popular president. It is during his administration that the Return to Africa movement takes place and the country of Liberia is created. So here you have a Liberian stamp with President Monroe on it. It is the only capital of any country that bears the name of a former of another country's president or king or person in power. Yes, Monrovia, Liberia is named after President Monroe. And a few more postage stamps bearing the picture of James Monroe. Thus ends our material lectures. Now, online, in studying for the test, there is the lecture on American culture that has the pictures. You need to know that as if I lectured to you on that. Plus, there are the biographies of the presidents. There is the Supreme Court is wrong about religion. I don't have the page in front of me at the moment, but on D2L, whatever is under test number 2, you look under content, under American history content, and then go under test number 2. Please learn all of that material, read all of that material under test number 2 for the second exam. There will be a couple questions from each of the biographies on the exam. Quite a few questions off the American culture under James Monroe. Please read through the Bill of Rights, First 10 Amendment of the Constitution. Not only did you see the movie, but I want you to refresh yourself and understand the Bill of Rights. There will be a number of questions on the test based on those. So please study for the test. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will try to answer your questions. On D2L, the outline of my lectures will help to serve as also a study guide for you as you're looking through your notes to make sure that all of the topics have been covered and that you know the information on all of the topics so that you can do well in studying for the exam. I hope you are all doing well at home, that none of you have yourselves or your family members fallen sick. Please be careful, wear gloves, do whatever is necessary to try and stay safe. Don't want anyone coming down sick with this. A very troubling, difficult times. I will send some emails out to you very shortly, but please stay safe and take care. Bye.